Welcome to VR Hermits, a podcast about virtual reality development. I'm Dave Ramsey.
And I'm Joe Simpson. How's it going, Dave?
Doing good, Joe. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's going to be a kind of a weird episode. Didn't have a ton of time to work on VR stuff this week because I spent most of the week looking for work. Need to refill the coffers. I've been running my bank accounts pretty low lately, working on VR stuff. So it's time to kind of go back into sales, whether that's on the FileMaker side or maybe doing some freelance work on the Unity side. But yeah, it's been a week of me trying to sell me to various people, and I've got a couple prospects lined up, but nothing really signed or for sure yet. But that stuff takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. I think I met with 8 different organizations last week, both remote meetings and in-person meetings, a lot of meetings downtown. And yeah, just been a busy week. It's kind of nice to know, even after a year of just kind of pulling back from most of the industry and just working on my own stuff, it's kind of nice to know that there's still so many people in my network that know who I am and answer my phone calls and are willing to meet with me. It's kind of gratifying. So.
I'm actually impressed that you lined up 8 meetings in a week on that short of a turnaround.
Yeah, it was a busy Monday morning just making calls and got a bunch of stuff lined up. And I've got a couple of things that may be starting soon. And then pretty good timing, one of my current customers contacted me with a potential new idea. And we talked a little bit about that on Friday. And not sure if we're doing it yet, but knowing them, we probably are. So yeah, just spent a lot of time away from Unity this week. And then I guess towards the end of the week, I can't really say why yet, but I started working with Unity landscape tools for a little side project I'm working on. And,
okay.
Yeah. More coming later, hopefully, if this turns into a thing. But it's just a little side project I'm working on, and particularly working with Unity landscape and just making some environments that I can run in Steam VR. And I immediately came across some very weird stuff that will be these are not news to anybody who's done VR for very long. I'm sure I found people documenting this issue back to like 2014, but just things that I hadn't considered before. Like grass in Unity is almost entirely 2D. You just have little 2D decals that you feed into the landscape engine, whatever that's called, and then you can paint that on your landscape like you can with the materials. But those 2D decals or sprites or whatever they are under the hood, they kind of react to the camera, which on a 3D game on the PC or PlayStation or whatever, that's exactly how that should work. When they kind of, because they're 2D, they always face the camera, and they kind of do some automatic rotation. But when you're in VR, it completely breaks the illusion. You see the entire, like all of the grass in the scene moving together every time you move your head. Just like, okay, this is a neat idea for something else that I'm not trying to do right now. But
sounds like a good paranoia game. The grass is watching me.
Or the dancing grass game. So yeah, similar issue with trees in Unity. It's a little bit, trees can be 3D objects or 2D objects. And that's not to say the grass thing, there are 3D solutions out there, but when you're adding that much geometry to a scene, you're going to take a performance hit. So I guess the biggest takeaways was that grass and trees in Unity, in VR in particular, kind of suck right now. Like they're really going to slow down your app and cut your frame rate down. Unity has made some improvements in how trees render recently in VR, and I did some experimenting with that. But yeah, it's kind of fun to run up to one of those limits in VR most of what I've done so far hasn't even slowed Unity or Unreal down at all, because I'm just doing such basic developer art type scenes. But as I started getting into closer to photorealistic stuff, it's amazing just how quickly the brakes got slammed. It also made me realize that I am, as much as I like my little MSI Trident, it is not a workstation class machine.
Okay.
As soon as I started throwing, hundreds or thousands of trees and rocks into a scene, like the editor slowed down quite a bit in a way that I haven't noticed so far. So yeah, I'm just learning about the different landscape tools, and then just making a greater variety of scenes that I've worked on so far. Mostly I've worked on indoor scenes and more abstract kind of cyberpunk type scenes, but getting into the photorealistic stuff is a bit different. So just, trying to learn some new stuff as I go. Also this week, last week we talked a lot about Steam VR, the plugin Steam VR in Unity, and whether or not I should use it, whether or not I should implement my own versions of certain classes. There's lots of places in the code where like, put your implementation here. And we talked about, if I do that, then the next Steam VR update that comes out, it's going to undo all my changes. And voila, there's a new Steam VR update this week. And it's not a huge update, but it fixed a couple bugs, and got rid of some deprecated stuff and added a few improvements. But it was just kind of like I was just about to start modifying a bunch of these things, and then this shows up. So like, I need to figure out what to do here. Other than that, I haven't really spent much time in Unity this week. There was some pretty cool stuff happening on the other side of the country. There was some kind of fancy conference this week. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. With something to do with consumer electronics. I don't know. It seemed like something was going on, but whatever it's called. Anyway, HTC announced their HTC Vive Pro, which, don't get me started on the pro word. I hate that. But it's basically a scaled up version of what they have now. It's got like a 78% increase in resolution, which I think is going to get us to the point where you can actually comfortably read text. Not just text in a UI in a game, but maybe even be able to work on the desktop, like in the Windows mixed reality headsets, be able to actually work with application windows for long periods of time without getting a headache. So I'm hoping for that. It looks like it's got a pretty nice build quality. They're building in its version of the deluxe audio strap with it rather than selling that as an add-on. There's some pretty good reviews I'll post links to from Road to VR. I've just been following their stuff all week, and it's some pretty cool stuff. They also announced a wireless accessory that I know you've got the TP Cast, and you've had your issues with it, but you're pretty satisfied with it. This one is Vive's in-house solution, and I'm sure it works great, but it looks really stupid.
That's the weird triangle thing?
Yeah, it looks fine in pictures, but then when you see it on the headset on somebody's head, it just looks really, really stupid. Like I was just giggling at some pictures of it earlier. Like, that can't be a thing.
I think you're underestimating how silly a VR headset looks on somebody's head to begin with.
No, I'm already calculating that. Like, I recognize how silly I look already with this thing, but putting this weird, it looks like a stick figure trying to hug the sun. Something like that. It's very strange. Some of the weird stuff that I haven't been able to find out more information yet is that wireless accessory is going to be compatible with the current generation of Vive and the Vive Pro. And then a different article mentioned that the new Vive Pro is going to use the Steam VR tracking 2.0 and not what we're on now. which I'm not sure if that's backward compatibility. Like, can I just go buy the new Vive Pro headset and keep my controllers and lighthouses, or do I need to replace all those things? Do I need to have 2 sets of everything set up if I want to use both headsets? There's still a lot of questions for me.
Well, that'll be great. Just an array of lighthouses on top of a tripod in these corners of the room.
Yeah.
Just a bank, like 6 of them.
Yeah. That would suck. I mean, people that have Vive and Rift are already doing that. But, yeah, that doesn't seem like it would be fun.
Yeah, I was looking at the thing, and the 78% increase in resolution sounds really tasty. But I've kind of got my rig all set up now. Like, I've got the Vive headset, and I've got the wireless set up, and the wireless is working, and this is all kind of happy. And I'm not entirely sure that right now I'm ready to go ahead and jump into the next tier of that. Yeah. So I'm kind of thinking in terms of like going to a TikTok sort of every other generation. I'll do whatever it takes to move to the latest thing. Mm-hmm. But that also assumes that nobody that I know gets a Vive Pro and puts it on my head. Because if I actually look at that resolution and I like it, there's a really good chance that I'll just end up going out and getting one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of with you on... It's not the top of my list of things that I want to get. It's definitely cool, and I wouldn't... If somebody was looking to get into VR and that's available, I would say go straight to that one. Don't bother with the first gen. At the same time, the only thing that would make me... I would want to wait like a month or so after it comes out for reviews and see what people think of it. But the thing that would sell it to me is, can I actually use Windows in it reliably? I don't think currently with the Vive you can use the Windows mixed reality platform in the same way that you can with the Windows mixed reality headsets, where you can actually launch that version of Windows 10. But if I can use things like virtual desktop or big screen and actually be able to work for long periods of time and read text clearly and use multiple windows, like that would be a big seller for me with that extra resolution. Yeah, I guess we'll wait and see. It may be a better purchase for me to just pick up one of the Samsung Odysseys instead and have 2 different types of headsets instead of 2 versions of almost the same thing.
Yeah, the other thing that would probably push me over the edge to pick one up is if they started doing a kind of a bundle thing that had that headset with its wireless thing, because I'm guessing the TP Cast is not going to be able to move enough pixels to do wireless with the higher resolution. I could be wrong. Somebody will figure it out. But if they had the new headset with the new wireless thing with whatever the tracking stuff is, and then they had the new Knuckles controllers, like a controller upgrade in there with everything, now we're really talking.
Yeah, they did confirm, HTC confirmed that the Knuckles are not going to be paired with the Vive Pro. And it sounded like the Knuckles thing is a Valve project. It's not specifically an HTC product. So the article I read was speculating that maybe Valve's just going to release this on their own like they did the Steam controller.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, the HTC Vive Pro is going to be paired with the same style of controllers that we have now, the wand controllers, but they're going to have Steam VR tracking 2.0 in them instead of 1 point whatever we have now.
Do you have any details on what that means?
No, not anymore. I used to kind of know, but I was confused about it and then got frustrated and closed that article.
Okay.
And that was 6 months ago. I know bigger play areas and more devices are a big part of it. Because I think they really want to get to the point where you can have like lots of VR accessories, like have your VR sword and shield mounted on the wall, and your VR shotguns, and your VR guitar, drum set, elevator, all those things. VR Segway. That gets pretty dangerous. So the other headset that I've been waiting on for 4 or 5 months now, the Daydream WorldSense headset that we've been waiting on basically since Google I/O last year, that was going to be out by the end of the year. wasn't out by the end of the year, obviously. One of those two headset manufacturers canceled on that, so HTC backed out of that one. We talked about that on the podcast. Lenovo is still on board with theirs, and they showed off a prototype this week. Let's see, what's it called? Mirage. It's a really nice looking headset. It's a WorldSense headset. It uses inside-out tracking. It's an entirely standalone device, so you don't plug it into anything. You don't put a phone in it. There's an article I'll link to. It's pretty specced out. It is a pretty nice piece of hardware. Snapdragon 835, some pretty good audio stuff, 4 gigs of RAM, nice big battery, a 5.5-inch display, pretty decent resolution. I think it's 2560 by 1440. So it's a pretty nice looking thing. The price hasn't been confirmed yet, but the article that I'm reading says it's going to be close to $400, which is a lot. I was really thinking these things were going to come out in the 200 to 250 range, like the Oculus Go. And this is a better piece of hardware than the Oculus Go, but not by much. And that's coming out at 200. Like I don't know. I don't know what's happening with this. At the end of the day, this is a 6 degree of freedom inside-out tracking headset, but you still have that little laser pointer head controller. And if there were, two motion track controllers like with the Vive or with the Windows mixed reality headsets, then I could see paying that much for it. But for basically being able to move my head around with a laser pointer, that's a lot of money. So we'll see what happens with that. But I don't know. It looks nice, but I just don't see that taking off for $400. Maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong.
Well, when we previously looked at the Daydream stuff, or when I did, when you showed it to me, I really had a problem if the headset did not have the full WorldSense capability.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe $400 WorldSense works, but part of the difficulty with a lot of these things is that until a friend of yours gets one, it's tough to know what it's doing for you.
Mm-hmm.
It was like when Apple was doing HDR displays and was trying to tell people about how cool it was to have an HDR display, but the projectors on their screens weren't HDR, so they couldn't show you the visual difference between an HDR and a non-HDR display because they only had non-HDR for purposes of demo. Mm-hmm. It's like, I can watch somebody do a review and talk about whether this is cool or not, but now it's how much I subjectively trust their interpretation is going to be similar to mine. Like, you like Daydream 3 degrees of freedom. I need the full 6.
Yeah.
And depending upon who listened to who, like for me, the extra $200 is easy. Like, I wouldn't buy the cheaper one because I don't like it. Yeah. But for you, it's like, well, that just seems too much. That's not a subjective judgment about your judgment. That's me just going, I don't know what that means.
I guess I was just really hoping that the 6 degree of freedom headset would also come with 6 degree of freedom controllers, but they're skipping the controller generation. Like, I don't know how, in terms of the apps that you can make with it, I don't know how different they're going to be, other than being able to move around in them, how different they're going to be than the current apps when you're still limited to the same interactions of using a laser pointer or a not very well tracked motion controller.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, there are a lot better developers out there than me that are probably already working on stuff. So I will probably end up getting one and complaining about the price anyway. So take this with a grain of salt. But I think if the Oculus Go comes out around the same time, I think the Oculus Go is a 3 degree of freedom headset, so that may not be your thing. But I still think that form factor is a really good kind of entry-level VR to get people into it that wouldn't normally buy it, especially people who don't want to have a high-end phone or go get a gaming PC, things like that. I don't know. I think that stuff could be really cool. It could also just be really disappointing. I guess it's too early to say because none of these products are out yet.
Yeah, that's also a little obnoxious.
Mm-hmm.
I like the Apple, okay, we're announcing this today and it's available next week. Thank you. Like, you showed me the cool product and now I get to wait 6 months?
Yeah, exactly. It'll be out by the end of the year, and now this one will be out sometime in Q2 of 2018.
Ow.
So yeah, there's that. So the only other quick topic I have, I don't run the Unity betas because I don't really need the distraction, but I saw a couple of people this week who are running the Unity betas tweeting about something that I think is very interesting. I think it's called the Unity Shader Graph Tool. It may have a more elegant name, but I couldn't find anything. But it is similar to the material editor in Unreal Engine, which is one of the things I really like the most about Unreal Engine, is being able to use the node-based system that they have for blueprints. They made something very similar for making materials and being able to pass in a texture here and do some functions on it and calculations and just kind of walk through the entire chain of the process and see how your material changes from node to node until you get to the end. It looks like Unity is building something similar in the 2018.1 beta, and all I did was just see a couple of tweets and screenshots and GIFs and got pretty excited about it, but not excited enough to go install the beta. I figured in 2 or 3 months it'll be on my machine and I'm sure I'll enjoy it, but just something that kind of made me happy.
I'm looking at it right now and it looks pretty slick.
Mm-hmm. Now see if you can find a screenshot of some shader code and see why I'm so happy.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I it's one of those things that I've always had a vague awareness of how complicated that could be.
Mm-hmm. Like, I'm sure I could figure it out if I really spent some time trying to learn it. But every time I just like, oh, okay, I'll just duplicate this shader and make some modifications myself. And I do that. I'm like, nope, nope, close that, back away slowly, back to the asset store. So anyway, that's my update. Like I said, not a ton of work this week on Unity stuff or VR stuff, but I've got some stuff in the works and just need to be able to keep the company up and running while I work on this stuff. So what are you working on?
Well, most of my week was spent on day job stuff. The good news is I got a lot done.
Nice.
Big accomplishments that have nothing to do with VR or game development. So I'm not going to go into them. But it was a really good week. The big thing game-wise that I'm playing with now conceptually is what to do next.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm torn in 2 directions. The first is, okay, I've got my clown game. My prototype was made and I've kind of established the concept. There's a lot of cool stuff that I can do with a bunch of extra work. But I think I could actually have something there. At some point, I should go ahead and make that. Like, that's established fact in my head, for lack of a better term.
Okay, cool.
That said, it doesn't say that's what you should do next.
Mm-hmm.
It just says, this is an item that's now on the to-do list somewhere. And it can even be someday maybe, but it's on the list. But that said, what was it, a week and a half ago?
Mm-hmm.
I got to play around with your play space for VR stuff with the puzzle game you're working on. And had a lot of fun playing with kind of slightly unstructured stuff in a VR environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it reignited for me the desire to do something in VR. Like I'd been playing with VR and playing more and more elaborate games, and as those things got more elaborate and better, the connection between those things and something that I could do was getting further and further apart. And
So you just needed some of my crappy code to inspire you.
No,
Joe can do this. I can do it too.
Just no. I knew you were going to do that, by the way. So it was really just that I didn't need to be making Fallout 4 to make something worthwhile or beyond worthwhile, just fun. Like with your stuff, and this was your play space, not your game, but a place for you to test out ideas and play with stuff. That was a lot of fun running around in there and throwing cubes around and bouncing things off of walls and hitting your ceiling fan and stuff like that. It was a blast. And so it reignited for me the desire to really dig in and start the VR stuff again. So the VR probably wins for two reasons. One, I'm a little bit more fired up about that. And two, we do have this podcast about VR development. So if I just spent all of my time developing in Unity, but not doing VR, my value is slightly off.
We have a VR podcast?
Yeah.
What's it called?
I've been recording this every week, Joe, and just releasing it without telling you.
What? Huh.
Months. It's been going on for months.
Wow. I hope it's doing well.
It's been doing fantastically.
So, do you have any ideas for what you want to make? Do you have you had a pretty good idea for the clown thing, for something to prototype. Do you have one of those in VR, or is it just a matter of kind of learning the tools and kind of getting inspired by what you're learning?
Yes, the second one.
Second one? Okay.
I just want to get in there and play around. I want to make some more cubes like you had in your play space and just play with some stuff. I've got an idea for something that's kind of an unstructured puzzle thing that maybe involves... Yeah, I don't know.
So I assume you want to do Steam VR stuff.
Absolutely.
In Unity. So I will send you a link to, and I'll put this in the show notes, to unity3d.college. It's a blog I've been following lately, and an email newsletter. And this developer or developers, I think there might be multiples, but it's mostly a guy named Jason. Tons of articles on just how to get started in various ways with the Steam VR plugin and the interaction stuff. So most of what I've learned has come from this blog. And frankly, he's filling in the gaps where Valve and Unity have just not made documentation. This has served as a really good third place for that, where that documentation should exist. It doesn't, but you can find the answers here.
So yeah, with that in mind, I was thinking in terms of, okay, we'll dig into this stuff. And a couple of days later, they announced the new version of the Steam VR plugin. And I said, perfect timing.
Yeah.
Whereas you were more of a, I was afraid of that.
Well, it was perfect timing because I hadn't actually modified any of the last versions. So.
Right. But still.
But I actually emailed the developer on this blog about that issue to see if he had any thoughts. Like, should I be using this plugin or should I just write everything myself using the OpenVR stuff in Unity? So I'm hoping he'll get back to me or maybe even write a couple of articles about it. Because he's written most of these Steam VR things before you had the option. And most of these articles predate Unity's native integration with OpenVR, which just came in like 2017.1. So I think that was barely 6 months ago. So yeah, it's now we've got the rendering all moved into Unity. I think that happened first, and then the next update they moved all of the controller stuff into Unity. There are now ways to use all of that stuff without ever touching the Steam VR plugin. It's just a matter of, do you want to build your own interactable objects? Do you want to build your own teleportation system? And lots of people do. And there are other things on the asset store. If you don't want to build that, or you don't want to use the Steam VR stuff, there are other options as well. I think I'm going to end up using the Steam VR stuff unless somebody more intelligent tells me not to, just because it's got so much. It's got the scene loading stuff that I want. It's got the teleport stuff, and it's really customizable with the teleporting. So I can use the same code that the lab uses, but visually and from a user standpoint, it looks and feels completely differently than what the lab uses. That's just how customizable they made it. I know you like the longbow example from the lab. That entire game mechanic is built right into the Steam VR interaction toolkit, so you can go play with that. And they use that as an example to expose something. What exactly is it called? Uh, Basically, item packages are, I think that's the right term, groups of VR objects. Like when you pick up the bow, you also pick up the arrows. You get those together.
Okay.
Those are like item packages, and they use the bow and arrow as an example of how to set those up in Unity. So it's a pretty neat concept. People do the same thing with like multiple guns, or even the little machine that controls that little vehicle in the lab. That's another one of those, or the machine that blows up balloons. Yeah, there's lots of good stuff. I would say start with the Steam VR plugin, read the README file, read the quick start guide. They both tell you to, for more information, read the other. And then click down into the interaction toolkit, and there's another README in there that you should read. And then start with this blog, the unity3d.college blog, and start reading through some of their stuff. And most of these articles are 3 to 5 minutes long, just quick examples of like how to get teleporting up and running, things like that, like how to pick up objects in Steam VR. And I think by the time 3 or 4 days of that, you'll start to get ideas pretty quickly of like more and more things to build. Like I'm definitely at the point where everything is a new game idea. like even that bug with the grass, it's like there's 3 or 4 game ideas with buggy grass that I could do.
Awesome.
So yeah, it's I don't know. There's a lot of really fun stuff. There's a lot of fun to be had here, both making games and playing games. So I'm interested to see what you come up with.
Me too.
So what else you got?
So we had kind of a mini topic. Well, hopefully a mini topic. Might drag on. We'll see. And it had to do with functional programming styles.
Okay.
And the value of them and how to understand them and things like that. Because even though it wasn't game development related, in the last couple of years, a lot of my day job programming has involved this, and I've kind of jumped into them with both feet and fallen in love with this style of development. And you're just kind of tapping into that at this point, or wondering whether you should even bother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't really done much with it myself, other than a couple of Swift functions, like just playing around with it in Swift Playgrounds. Like, oh, that's how to use map. That's neat. Anyway, back to work.
Yeah, so we're talking about the kind of map, reduce, filter sort of programming constructs. I have a tendency to use kind of the generic terms that have a tendency to be like this map reduce kind of thing. There are similar concepts in C# that can then work in Unity. And I checked out a couple of them, so they do work.
So before you dive into the details, what is functional programming?
Wow. In its most generic form, gosh, I gotta like look up a definition. There is a lot of the functional programming stuff that involves passing complete subroutines as parameters to functions. Okay. So you're passing functions around as a data type that you can just pass into something. And so what that gives you the ability to do is say, oh, I've got this thing that knows how to interact with my custom data structure. And I can pass it a parameter that's an entire function that takes inputs and everything, has parameters. And my manager object can go, okay, cool, thanks for the function. I'm now going to run this against all of your objects and then give you back a result. Really powerful, really tough to wrap your head around. At least for me. Like, honestly, I'm barely scratching the surface of this. But for the pieces that I've gotten into, there's some kind of simplified versions that you can start with that I think are easier to pick up. And these are things like the map function. So the best analogy that I've come up with for describing how to think about some of these functions is set theory. So most programmers will have a relatively clear idea of what the intersection between two sets looks like. Mm-hmm. Like, I've got a set of all the students who are in class A and the names of all the students who are in class B, and I can intersect those two and get a list of all the students that are in both classes. And the terminology for doing this has been clearly established for 140 years. I looked, it's like 1870 is when modern set theory really became a thing. And so, union and intersect and doing like an XOR or something like that, these sorts of things are clearly established concepts that have been around for a really long time. And if you're doing computer programming, you can say, oh, I have set A, I have set B, give me the intersection of these two sets. And you just ask for the intersection and you get the intersection. You get the things that are in both. However, there's nothing to stop you from writing that the long way. So you could write that as, okay, take set A and iterate through each element in set A. And as you get each element, look to see if it exists in set B. And if it does exist in set B, then go ahead and stick it in set C. But if it doesn't, then don't. And when you're done, return set C.
Yeah, that's probably 25% of the FileMaker code that I've written.
Right.
Is doing some of that.
And that's because FileMaker doesn't have any kind of array manipulation functions of that variety. Dealing with sets in that way, we just don't have the tools. But in something like Swift or C# or JavaScript, you can just say, set A, set B, give me the intersection, hand it back. Okay, so you get the shorthand that just gives you the short version. So map and reduce and filter and these kinds of functions are just like intersect, union, and whatever, but about dealing with sequential data types. For our purposes today, let's talk about just arrays.
Okay.
So I've got an array. There are a series of things that we want to do to arrays really often. Okay? One of them is filter the array. Go through each of the items in the array and decide whether to keep it or not. And of the ones that you decided to keep, hand that back. That's a you've done that 1,000 times in FileMaker. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, in FileMaker, you always have to do it the long way. In classic programming, you would make a loop and loop through each of the items in A and run an equation against it, some little test that you wrote that says whether you keep it or not. And if you keep it, then you stick it over in another array, array B, and when it's all done, you hand array B back. In a filter functional programming function, you say, take this array, filter it using this equation. And that's all you have to hand it. You get back the filtered array. Okay, so it replaces about 8 lines of code with a single line of code that's very clear about what it's doing. You can read it and say, okay, I'm starting with this array, and then I'm going to be getting back an array that is some subset of that original array's set in their existing form. So if I handed it a bunch of browser pages, I'm going to get back browser pages, because nothing in this is going to transform any of these objects. I'm just removing items from the list. That's all I'm doing. And so even though it's very concise and very short in the way that it expresses, it doesn't lose any of its expressiveness. It actually gains expressiveness. Because if you just bumped into a loop that starts with like, oh, I've got an array of browser pages, and now I'm going to do something with it in a loop, you have to look at that loop to figure out whether you're converting things or just aggregating things or making a smaller list. And you can get around some of that with some commenting, but then you bump into issues where your comments may not keep up with your changes in code and stuff like that. Filter makes it very easy to just say, give me the smaller set. The map function, which in C# would end up being convert all if you're just working with a list, or there's some other stuff that you can do with the select statement through link, which I'm not really going to get into, but if people cared about that, you can go look there. But what this map function says is, for every single item in array A, I'm going to give you back an item in array B. And here is how you extract the pieces that I want. That's all you have to hand it. And so I can look at it and go, oh, there's a map statement, which means that I'm going to get back the exact same number of items. All that's going to change is that basically the type of the object is going to change. So I'm handing it a set of browser pages, and all I want back is the URLs for those browser pages. It's a one-to-one correspondence. So it's just browser page URL, browser page to URL, and I get back a list of strings. Yay. But it's actually very clear because it just says, browser page array dot map, and then in the language specific functional designation, you say current browser page dot URL. That's it. And it just goes through each of the items in the list and goes, oh, let me grab the URL and stick that over here. There's a separate function that you would use if you want to say, some of these browser pages will fail a test and I don't want those back, but map the rest of them. So what that does is, right there in the function name, you know that you may be getting back a smaller array. So what it does is, then you can start chaining these things. Okay, well, let me start with, does that make any sense?
So a little bit. I think maybe this is just me spending too much of my life in databases, but I'm trying to translate it through my own experience, and it seems closer to execute SQL statements of like how to get certain fields or certain calculated results out of a table. It seems similar in that regard. Like I can select all the records in a table where in line I'm also doing a sum of related data, and the result of that sum is greater than 50. Things like that. It seems similar to that kind of conceptually. Obviously, I'm not writing functions in SQL. I'm just writing out all that as a select statement. But I think, I don't know, I need to actually do some of this. Is there, before you get on to chaining them together, is there like a set, core set of functions that most languages implement, things like map and filter, or are there a half dozen of these? Are there many dozens or hundreds of them?
There's quite a few. Most people get most of what they want out of about 4 or 5.
Okay.
90% of my work is done with, and these are the Swift terms, map, filter, for each, which is kind of like your standard for each loop,
Mm-hmm.
but it does it in the functional style, which just makes it easy to chain. Like the for each loop is the long verbose version of just this for each functional thing. So yeah, map, filter, for each. Some people really get into reduce, which is about combining items or reducing them to another set. So for example, with reduce, you would say, I have an array of numbers and I would like to add them all up. The basic version is, okay, make an integer, now loop through each of the items and add the value to the integer.
Mm-hmm.
But reduce just gives you a short way to say, add each item to the item before it, run through the list, done.
So can you do things with reduce on like vector 3s? Could you reduce a list of vector 3s or an array of vector 3s?
Almost certainly. I'm just not sure what the equation would be that you'd be using. Okay. But sure. Yeah, if you want to take you've got 10 different force vectors being applied to an object and you want to figure out what the end result of all of that vector math is, mm-hmm. That's a reduce thing. And so you would just say, here is my array of vectors. Here's how you combine vectors. It's basically like x1 plus x2, comma, y1 plus y2, comma, z1 plus z2 sort of thing.
Yeah. You could pass in other functions, right? So I could pass in Unity's, whatever Unity's functions are for adding vectors.
Sure.
Or multiplying vectors, or whatever that.
Absolutely. Like. Yeah, if you want to use their faster vector math stuff, potentially optimized vector math, absolutely. You can call equations in there. You can write, and this is where it gets into the larger part of the functional programming, you can write a 15-line function in the middle of this thing. And the cool part is when I'm looking back at my code, I'm looking and it says, oh, this is a reduce. So I know that everything that's happening in the next 15 lines, all it's going to do is cram this down into one value at the end. Okay, thanks. The details of that are kind of inconsequential. I'm hoping that my comments will tell me what's happening there. But if it's a big complex thing, I at least know in the chain of events that I took a big array, I filtered it down to a smaller set, and then I crammed those all down into one value. Thank you very much. And it's a little weird when you first start playing with it, but once you get it, A, they're not hard to write. And B, they're actually really, really expressive. It makes it very easy to go back and read my code later and be able to get the large generalities of what a particular function is doing very quickly when it ends up just being take an array and apply a series of operations to it and give me back a result. And 3 lines of functional programming functions are way more expressive than 20 lines of code with comments.
So did you use any of these functions in your clown prototype?
I did at one point. Hang on a second, and maybe I will look for it.
Okay.
I can't seem to find the code. But basically what I've got is there are players that are in the game, and then they get hit by clowns, and they become player clowns. And so what I need to do is filter through that list to make sure that when the last player gets killed, they are that we signal the end of the game. And I think I've rewritten this stuff, but it was relatively easy to just go, okay, make a list of all the player game objects. Not an array, but a C# list object. And the cool thing about lists is they are editable. You can say to this list, remove an item from the list. And so I could then say, take this list and now filter it by still a player. And that got me what I wanted. Whereas if you're looking at kind of child game objects, it can be a little tough to do some of those set operations without doing the 10 lines of code to say, build a new list, now add an item to the list each time that it's a player and not a player clown. So I could filter from that and then do something like a map, in C# terms, a convert all, to turn that into a list of the player names. So I could have this separate array that's just the player names. I could use that for reporting purposes or something like that. But anytime I wanted to convert array A into a similar array B, it was just a single line of code.
Okay, so I've got an example maybe we can talk through and see if this is a good application for functional programming, and if so, what functions and what I should use, or even if I should even do this. So I've got a laser turret that can target lots of different types of objects, basically anything on a tag called enemy, which I still need to change that name to something else because I'm confusing myself because the laser turrets are the enemy, but they're targeting the enemies. So yeah, that's bad naming on my side. But basically anything that has this tag can be a potential target, but the types of game objects that can have that tag are very, very different. The player can be on that tag. You could have various interactable objects. You could have kind of moving walls or shields. Maybe even other AI players that are working with the player, or even other laser turrets that could see each other as enemies under certain circumstances. So lots of things could have this. So I thought about adding a component called like level of interest, where this component is basically just there to hold a value of the base level of interest. Everything starts with 100. Anything less than 100 is less interesting. Anything more than 100 is more interesting. And then changing the way that some of the turrets work. Right now, the current one that I have focuses on the nearest object. So it uses Sensor Toolkit to get a list of results that it's sensing that is within its field of view and can actually see in the line of sight. And then it just gets the closest one to that by calculating the transforms. I'm wondering if I could replace that functionality in some levels or just certain turret types with ignore the closest one, give me the most interesting one. So the player could evade the turret by throwing it a more interesting target to be distracted with, things like that. So at that point, I would be I know how to add the component, and I know how to get the list of those objects back by those component. And my next step was going to be loop through those and sort them into a way that I want, and then get the first one out of that. Do you think that is a good use for functional programming?
Probably. So what you're looking for there in C# is an order by.
Okay.
And so what you're doing with order by, you're saying, I've got an array, I've got a list. Order these items so that the end result is going to be a list of the exact same length, but they will now be in order. And then all you have to hand it as basically the parameter to this thing is a little description of how it compares two objects and decides which one comes first. You just hand it that equation, and it does the work and hands you back an array that is sorted in the correct order. So that to get the most interesting thing, you don't have to go, okay, well, have a value that stores the current most interesting thing on the list, and then the current value of the most interesting thing, and then loop through all the items on the list and see if something's more interesting than the one that we've currently got saved, and kind of run through it that way. And that's totally functional. You can do it that way. But just doing order by is pretty simple, and it'll just be a question of performance.
So can I actually whatever I get back from Center Toolkit is a list of game objects with their attached components. So could I get that list of objects? I think it's an iList for some reason. They went with iList instead of list.
Okay.
But I get an iList back of game objects. So I would do some kind of order by call on the game objects dot get component, and then specify my component name. Do you think it would work out that far, or would I have to write some kind of custom logic to get that component?
Nope. You can make a chain of stuff, but like I said, you can even do entire functions. Like you could have 10 lines of code as part of this order by. But the end result of what you need in that order by is how to determine if A is earlier than B. Mm-hmm. That's all that equation needs to reduce to. But you can make that equation as long as you want. It could be 200 lines of code. You're probably going to be able to do it with a single line of code.
Yeah.
Which is, let's do another small pause, and I will, Safari new C# list order by, because I think, yeah, it's just a single thing. So what you end up doing is you end up saying, okay, I've got my list O game objects dot order by, and then in parentheses, basically the function that you hand it is just like, okay, each time you find one of these things, call it an OBJ. I need to, it's like the for each. You name the thing that's coming off of the stack or off of the list. You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. So you have to name it here, and then you just say, I've got this object. So now that the value that this object has is expressed as object dot get component your interest thing dot number plus or minus some other number. But there you go. That's it. This number. That's how you do it. And so when you're doing the order by, you end up telling it whether to, you have to do it in inverse.
Yeah, because basically I just want I know I have to kind of order by the entire list and get the entire list back, but really all I want is the single object with the highest value at the end of that.
Yeah. So there's a thing in here where you can designate whether you want it to order. There's order by and then order by descending.
Okay.
So you're going to do order by descending and then hand it how to get the number. That's it. And when you're done running that, the 0th element on that list will be the most interesting thing in the world.
So are these concepts tied to that list function or the list functionality in C#, or is this something that I could use on iList, or do I need to convert my iList to list somehow?
So order by is specific to list.
Okay. So
you may just have to map the iList to a list. Most of those things have kind of what do they call it in Swift? It's like toll-free bridging. Mm-hmm. You can just map these things over. They convert pretty cleanly. So it's just as lists, and you get your thing back. Or there's another whole set of them that go through what's called LINQ. LINQ. And that's a technology that operates similarly, but works more generically. So it works across all enumerable object types.
Okay.
And so what you can do is you can even have your own custom class that contains innumerable stuff, and you can make your class basically subscribe to the IEnumerable protocol, and now your thing can have these special things run against it. So the LINQ stuff is more general, but it's a little bit more complicated to use. Most of the time I was working with lists in my programming, and so just staying there and using the the slightly simpler list-based version
Yeah.
was good for me.
It sounds like I may want to look at link though, because the data I'm getting back is already an iList or an enumerable list. Maybe that's how they intend me to get to this stuff.
Versus list. Let's see. You may actually be able to use it directly. It's the stuff that I'm reading here is suggesting that list is an implementation of the iList interface.
Oh, nice.
You may just be able to go directly to it. Give it a shot. I mean, literally all you have to do is type in one example, and it will either let you compile or not. Yay, modern compilers. Yeah, it'll start telling you that there are problems with that very, very quickly if there's a problem with it.
Yeah. And then once I get that part figured out, it's just a matter of, I would probably want to turn this into a coroutine. I don't want this running every frame. Not only because it wouldn't be performant, but I don't really want the turret changing targets that quickly.
Right.
I want it to be more of a dumb AI. There's like every second, maybe up to every second, it could change targets, but maybe once it's locked on to a target and rotating, it can't retarget until either it's finished targeting or a certain time passes. I don't want a super quick, like super reactive turret just swinging around faster than the player can react. I want it kind of like, mockable dumb AI. Like, haha, you stupid AI, you went for this fish.
Yeah.
Stupid laser.
There are elements to the way, and this gets into kind of a weird technical place, but there are elements to the way that the link implementation is done that may be more performant for your purposes. Because in the end, you don't care about the entire array. You just want the first item off of the array.
Mm-hmm.
So in the list implementation, it produces an entirely new array. And in the link implementation, it kind of builds this weird data structure that points all over the place, but doesn't actually do all the work until you start pulling items off the array. So what that means is that, like, you may get a speed benefit from doing it the link way. The cool thing is that since link works on anything sequenceable, then it'll work just as fine on the iList as anything else would.
Nice.
But this is one of those weird spots where, like, Microsoft never throws anything away. They keep all of their technology basically forever, and it has advantages and disadvantages. And the primary disadvantage is there are 30 different ways to do anything that you want to do. And finding... I've basically given up on finding the best for any particular case, and instead just say, I found one that's good enough. And so you can try the basic order by and see if that meets your needs. And if it's too slow, you can look into the other stuff, or vice versa.
Cool. I will give it a shot. Well, that was a good primer. I'm sure I'll have more questions once I start doing some of this stuff, but it was a good primer on functional programming.
If you send me the equation that you would use to get, like, from a particular object to the value that you want, I'll do a basic wrap-up of that and send it back to you so that you can see, oh, this is the difference between those two things. It's not that much.
You'll functional programify things for me?
Absolutely.
There's your next development tool. Paste in your function here.
Ooh.
But it's really just you on the other end quickly rewriting it and sending it back.
This would only work because there's only 5 people in the planet who would use it. The other thing is, once I've done it 4 times, you're going to go, oh, that's it? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And you'll never use it again. Because it will just, the 5-second turnaround time to get your result back will just be too long to wait. So yeah.
Awesome.
Man, was there anything else we were going to talk about?
Not on my end. I think we hit it all.
Huh. Okay. I guess what I'll say in closing is all of the above about functional programming was probably entirely wrong. But it's been working. I've been getting good use out of it, and it all works. My understanding of what's happening behind the scenes or behind the curtain may be not 100% correct, but if you stick A in and get out B every time, there is a kind of understanding that comes from that. This is the kind of understanding that normally makes Joe throw up his hands and run screaming from the room. But but I did not commit 3 months of my life to understanding functional programming, which is probably to my detriment.
I will try not to commit 3 months of my life to understanding functional programming. You never know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's funny you have to mention stuff like that. Like, hey, everything we said may be wrong. We are the same people who did a previous podcast called Massively Unqualified Development. So maybe we should put a disclaimer somewhere on the VR Hermits site of we have no idea what we're talking about.
I wrap all of that up in the we're all just learning this, and you're coming along for the ride. Anything that we say in this episode may be entirely supplanted by anything that we say in any following episode.
Or any previous episode.
And if we don't supplant it in a future episode, that does not mean that this one was correct. It just means we never got back to it. So your mileage may vary.
I mean, depending on where you are in the podcast, I am either working on an Unreal Engine project, a Daydream project in Unity, a Daydream project in Unreal Engine, a Steam VR project in Unreal Engine, or a Steam VR project in Unity, or all of them. It's like the quantum theory of VR Hermits. Like, you never really know what Joe's working on until you interrogate.
I'm just glad that we didn't work Unreal into the name of the podcast somewhere. We would have had to rename the podcast 8 times.
Yeah, you were up for that at first.
Yeah.
Ideas.
Yeah.
Something about virtual unreality or something.
Yeah. Well, that's the good part about brainstorming is come up with as many bad ideas as humanly possible, and they will become very apparent to you.
Yeah, if we ever run out of show titles, we can just start using some of our potential names for the podcast. We have some good ones.
That's our show for today. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm VRHermit_Dave.
And I'm VRHermit_Joe. And if you can, like us or rate us in your podcast player of choice and share us with some friends, either in the VR development space or anyone who may be interested in these topics. Thanks for listening.